There's a moment when you look around at the world and you realize that everything feels strangely impoverished. Institutions feel hollow, systems feel brittle. A lot of people talk about NPC energy going around. Leaders feel temporary. The future feels unanchored. And if you're Gen X, you feel that hollowness with a particular kind of clarity. Because you grew up in a world where institutions still had weight. They weren't perfect, but they were solid. They were built on something. Now, it feels like the scaffolding is just standing, but the interior has been gutted. And the question that keeps circling in your mind is, was it always like this? Or did something break? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of America, not the beginning of capitalism, not the beginning of democracy, but the beginning of civilization itself. The moment the first machine was built. Civilization didn't begin with art or philosophy or religion. It didn't begin with kings or crowns or temples. It began with irrigation. It began with water. It began with the simple, brutal fact that if you controlled the water, you controlled the food. And if you controlled the food, you controlled the people. In ancient Sumer, survival depended on canals. The rivers flooded unpredictably, and the land dried out quickly. If you wanted to live, you needed someone to manage the flow. Someone to decide when the gates opened, when the fields were watered, when the labor was organized. So the first leaders weren't heroes. They were irrigation managers. And that's the part of history most people don't really pay attention to. Hierarchy did not begin with a crown. It began with a ledger. The earliest writings we have from the city of Uruk isn't poetry or prayer. It's grain tallies, list of rations and debts and labor quotas. The world's first quote-unquote elites were the people who knew how to count the surplus. They were the ones who stood at the bottleneck between the fields and the storehouses. They were the first nodes. Once you see that, the ancient world stops looking like the myth and starts looking like infrastructure. The ziggurats, those massive stepped temples, weren't just religious monuments. Structurally, they were granaries built above flood level. The gods, that was the narrative pillar, but the grain was the power. The priesthood didn't rise because they were holy. They rose because they controlled the ledger. And Egypt followed the same pattern. The first pharaohs didn't unify the Nile because they were destined to rule. They unified it because they consolidated the irrigation basins. The Narmer palette, the famous carved stone showing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, isn't just an artifact. It's a record of resource consolidation. One man capturing the grain flows of an entire river system. Dynasty began the moment resource control became hereditary. When ancient civilizations collapsed, the hierarchy didn't disappear. The machine didn't die. The dynasties didn't vanish. They simply migrated. Take the Akkadian Empire. There was a 300-year drought that hit Mesopotamia. The canals dried up. The grain failed. And the tax base, it evaporated. The empire fell. But the families who ran the temples and the storehouses, they didn't vanish. They governed their own regions, kept their ledgers, preserved their knowledge, and waited for the next resource shift. Collapse wasn't the end of hierarchy. Collapse was a sorting mechanism. The machine survived because the machine wasn't the state. The machine was the structure, the nodes, the ledgers, the knowledge, the techniques. Civilization fell. the hierarchy reset. Once you understand that, the present moment stops feeling like a unique disaster and starts feeling like a familiar pattern. The pillars crack, the resource shifts, the old machine falters, the new machine begins to assemble itself from the pieces. We're not the first people to live through a transition like this. I am going to talk later on about something we are the first to encounter, however. But we're not the first people to watch the old pillars crumble while the new ones are still being built. In episode 5, we're going to move forward in time to the medieval world, the moment when the ancient machine broke apart and hierarchy learned its most important lesson. Power doesn't need a state. Power can survive in fragments. Power can become modular. And once it becomes modular, it becomes immortal. Before I get to the books in this episode, if you hear me make some, or if you have any questions for that matter, please feel free to comment, or like, or subscribe, while I figure out the structure of how I'm getting this thing going. For episode 4, if you're interested in this content, a couple books you might like are Karl Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism, or Samuel Kramer's History Begins at Sumer. Thank you.